Chine here. Just a note before we get started. Remember how Maddy's expecting a baby? Well...
Sorry, I was just a bit distracted because I was having a contraction then.
A bit more about that later, but on to today's episode, which is a really difficult one, where we tackle some really challenging issues, including miscarriage and baby loss and death. So please take care. Mummy, can children die? The words came from my then 5-year-old who was sitting at the back of the car as I drove him home from school. I'd long dreaded the question, but I still wasn't prepared for it. I winced. Yes. And knew in that moment that something of his innocence had been taken away. Like every mother, I'd wanted not only to keep him safe from physical harm, but also to protect him from the knowledge of heartbreak and pain. I know that I began to see the world differently when, as a child, I realised that such a horror was possible. Death is something we must all wrestle with, but the death of a child is a tragic upending of the order of things. There is no word in the English language for a parent whose child has died. Widows and widowers have lost their spouses, orphans have lost their parents, but a parent whose child has died, whether in Israel or Gaza or Ukraine or Sudan or here in the UK, it's too painful for us to even name. In the massacre of the innocents, the children killed by King Herod after the birth of Jesus, the Gospel of Matthew alludes to an Old Testament passage that reads, "A voice is heard in Ramah, weeping and great mourning, Rachel weeping for her children and refusing to be comforted, because they are no more." I've long found this passage haunting because it paints a vivid picture of my worst nightmare. For some, though, the pain of losing a child is not just a nightmare, but a living and waking reality. Hello, you are listening to Motherhood versus the Machine. This is a podcast about motherhood, but not just about motherhood, not really. It's about what makes us human, what distinguishes us from machines, what can be automated and what could never replace the human touch. I'm Chine MacDonald, director of the religion think tank Theos. I'm also a mum of 2 little boys.
And I'm Dr. Madeline Pennington, Head of Research at Theos. I'm also a mum. I've got a young daughter and another baby on the way. The rise of technologies like generative AI make the distinction between human nature and automation, or even simulation, one of the biggest and most urgent questions of our time. There is a gap between what we ask of machines and what we know is important for our own human experiences. But exactly where that gap starts and ends isn't always clear. And here we think that thinking about mothering can help us. In previous episodes, we've explored what the work of mothering is, how it should be valued economically, and why the economy isn't all there is to it.
What happens in the 19th century is that the economy becomes something located outside the home. It's somewhere that men and perhaps women who don't have children go to sell their labour in exchange for wages.
We've asked what, for some mothers, it means to carry and birth another person, and explored what the vulnerability of mothers, as they feed their children, says about human nature.
And understood myself really for the first time as a truly interdependent being. I wasn't this kind of individual, machine-like, atomised earner, consumer, self-sufficient unit.
In our final episode, we're exploring what motherhood teaches us about loss, grief, and change. After all, underlying the literal bodily vulnerability of motherhood is a more fundamental vulnerability still. We are exposed because we care, because we love, and perhaps we fear what might happen if that caring turns out not to be enough. Realising the limits of our capacity to protect what's most precious, including the knowledge that we will die and that our children will die, perhaps too soon, is a lesson all parents must learn, and no parent really wants to. So what does a mother's grief, even a mother's fear of grief, reveal about what it means to be human? For many, this story begins long before the birth of a child.
When I was in my 20s, I experienced a number of pregnancy losses, which included 2 ectopic pregnancies, one of which was life-threatening.
That's Karen O'Donnell, a lecturer in the Faculty of Divinity at the University of Cambridge and author of The Dark Womb, Reconceiving Theology Through Reproductive Loss.
And that experience was just unexpectedly life-altering and broke me in ways I was not anticipating, and in ways that people around me couldn't seem to understand. The resultant kind of end point was that I had a diagnosis of being infertile and some options of medical technology to help me potentially get pregnant, but actually I'd never taken up those options. So I don't have any children.
Karen reflected on how these experiences were not just emotionally devastating, but challenged everything she believed, requiring her to reevaluate how she saw the world in unexpected ways.
I'm always saying theology is something human-made. It's produced out of our bodies. And what I discovered was that the bodies that had been through pregnancy loss had the potential to produce a particular kind of theology.
Karen is far from alone. Pregnancy loss is a common experience. About 1 in 8 known pregnancies end in miscarriage, but it's thought that the true number is far higher still. Globally, the World Health Organization estimates that approximately 1 in 4 pregnancies, a quarter, end in miscarriage. On top of this, nearly 2 million babies are stillborn every year.
Often as well, I have friends who are priests who will anecdotally tell me people will turn up at church after a pregnancy loss looking for something, or chaplains in hospitals will often find that they have people who turn up in a chapel, or they're called to the bedside to offer some kind of spiritual comfort. And I'm convinced that there is something deeply spiritual happening in this experience, or that people are experiencing it in a deeply spiritual way.
And yet this is something we struggle to talk about, both as individuals and as societies.
The experience of pregnancy loss is really a kind of bundle of taboos. So it's blood, it's things that happen around genitals, it's death, it's this fetus that's not fully formed yet, it's the pregnant body, which is not quite 2, but not just 1. And any one of those things is taboo in and of itself. But the experience of pregnancy loss kind of bundles so many of those taboos together. It becomes almost super taboo.
Throughout the series, we have grappled with what it means to exist as bodies, both how challenging that can be and what it can reveal. For women experiencing pregnancy loss, this relationship can take on a whole new significance again.
And so there was this period of about 4 or 5 years where I really felt like my body was something that I was very disappointed in, very let down by, very angry at, and almost quite alienated, because what I wanted and what my body did seemed to be so vastly different. It still feels very disconcerting because I know that that was true. And yet I would always want to say that we are our bodies.
That painful dissonance challenged her to ask a whole series of questions.
And one of the things that I've really learned about bodies through this experience and through the work that I've done subsequently is that we should trust bodies. And so I felt like I had to police my emotions a lot when I went through pregnancy loss. And actually, one of the things that I worked through when I was writing The Dark Room was that people have all kinds of emotions to pregnancy loss and they're all correct.
For those experiencing pregnancy loss, validation can be central. And as more people have started speaking about these experiences, so too society has got better at recognising them. The deaths of babies after 24 weeks gestation, that is stillbirths, have been officially registered since 1927 in England and Wales, and since 1939 in Scotland. But from 2023, bereaved parents who lost a baby before 24 weeks of pregnancy in Scotland could register their loss in the Scottish Government's Baby Loss Memorial Book. In February 2024, baby loss certificates were launched in England.
Hello, I'm Emma Barnett and welcome to Woman's Hour from BBC Radio 4. I felt the act of applying for a baby loss certificate almost to be a political one. A refusal that something so major in our family's life was not to be erased, was something to be known about, recorded. And when the certificate arrived, a mere 10 days later, in its crisp envelope, I sort of wondered what this was when it dropped through the door, and printed on thick white paper, complete with an official government masthead, I've got it here in the studio, I felt weirdly satisfied, almost vindicated. It had happened. There was some physical proof that something external to me, which my husband and our children, here it was, when they're older, could read as part of the story of our lives, alongside perhaps our marriage certificates, birth certificates, and all the other paraphernalia that documents our existences in a family file of sorts. Our certificate, when I take it back home, will be filed in the folder alongside the birth certificates of our other children. Children I am so very fortunate to have.
That was Emma Barnett, talking about her experience of reproductive loss and the significance of baby loss certificates in her own journey of grief.
It's probably 15 years since my last pregnancy loss now. I don't refer to myself as a mother, even though these things happen within my body, and I want to remember that these beings that I consider children existed. My body doesn't feel like a mother's body, whatever that means.
Mothering for Karen has become more of a verb than an identity.
But what has been interesting for me is the appearance of nieces and nephews, which I did not have when I was experiencing pregnancy losses, and they came along a little bit later. And the incredible instant love that I felt for them, and an immediate sense of parental feeling for them, which helped me think about what it means to mother. And I'm probably more comfortable with that as a verb. Mothering is something I do rather than something I am. I've also had friends who've adopted, friends who've fostered, and I've seen what mothering means in lots of different contexts, where it's got nothing to do with blood and biology, but it's to do with relationship.
In our first episode, Maddy and I talked about the joy of finding out we were both pregnant. But there's something that we didn't tell you. Our colleague, Lizzie, who's our head of communications at Theos, also was part of this story.
Yes, it was really early days, but I'd accidentally let slip to Maddy that I was pregnant, and she told me she was pregnant. So we kind of had this lovely secret, both expecting babies for the first time. But shortly after that, it was probably about 5 weeks or so, experienced some bleeding, which every pregnant woman dreads. I went into the early pregnancy unit and we had a scan, and we were told that it was inconclusive. They couldn't find a heartbeat. So they said, come back next week, which we did. And we were told that there was a heartbeat, and we heard it, and it was a miracle. And we were so relieved. But as the weeks moved on, I couldn't really put my finger on it, but I just knew that something had changed in my body. It didn't quite feel the same as it had. I spoke to a good midwife friend of mine that assured me that this kind of thing could be really normal. And so I kind of tried to reassure myself that there was no need to worry. I think it was around 11 weeks pregnant, and I went on a bike ride and I came back and just, there were signs that things weren't right. And so we went into the hospital again, long wait in the emergency room, and had a scan. And were given the news that we dreaded. In a matter-of-fact kind of way, the sonographer pulled out a couple of leaflets from her drawer and put them down on the table, and she told us we'd had what's called a missed miscarriage at 11 weeks, and the embryo growing in my womb, she said, wasn't viable. I'd lost the pregnancy. And then she gave us these options: surgical management of miscarriage, medical management of miscarriage. We didn't know what either of these things were, so we kind of left the hospital, both in silence, really. You want to be grieving the loss of something that you really longed for. We were faced with this admin of what did we want to do next. I made the decision to have surgery. It just felt that everything was so out of our control that it was something I almost kind of wanted to be able to just grieve, have peace with, and be able to move on. So I did. And that was a weird feeling, going back into the hospital under general anaesthetic and leaving with my womb empty, kind of a mother but not a mother. A few months later, by this point, I think Maddy was almost full term, and Chine, I think you were about 6 months pregnant. I was pregnant again, but had another miscarriage at 7 weeks. At the time, I was 39, about to turn 40, and I'd lost 2 pregnancies in short succession. And I think was just really asking the big questions: will this happen for me? How do I feel if it doesn't?
What I imagine must have been extremely painful was we were pretty much exactly the same pregnant. So we were due around the same time. We would have been due around the same time. There was the kind of the reality that I was going to be going off and having a baby. So like some practical implications. Maddy had gone off a few weeks before me. So I think Maddy's daughter was born in March. Mine ended up being born in April. And so then we were gone and you were still there. So I also imagine that was that a relief?
I mean, Chine, you might remember that I handed in my notice.
Oh, yeah.
I handed in my notice because I think the trauma of it, really, it just became too much. And I remember handing in my notice to you. It was shortly before you went off on mat leave. And I felt really guilty because I thought, I'm putting this on Chine's plate now. But actually, I wasn't able to think rationally. I don't know if that's the word. I just needed to not be in that situation anymore. It was a joyful time for you and Maddy. It just was, unfortunately, so closely aligned with the most tragic of times in my life. My sister-in-law became pregnant at a very similar time to we had the second miscarriage, and that was so difficult because I was going to have a new nephew, and it felt like in our family the same thing, you know. Somehow you can't escape pregnancies. You can't escape someone pushing a pram down the street. I remember the baby on board badges used to just trigger so much emotion in me when I'd sit on the train coming into work. And then I'd come into work and there were lots of conversations about mat leave, and there were just 2 big pregnant bellies in front of me.
Often these conversations, especially in the church, can turn to, but you've had a baby now. And isn't it all right now? How do you wrestle with the babies you've lost and the baby that you have, and how you kind of wrestle with those 2 identities almost?
Good question. I have an 18-month-old little girl, and one thing I think I can't compare, because I can't ever be in a situation where I didn't experience pregnancy loss, but I just know that every day I'm so grateful. When we found out we were pregnant, my way of sharing it was very different. On social media, I didn't share the scan picture, or I didn't, all the things that I think I remember finding really hard, I didn't do. I put a post up of me pregnant, I think at 8 months, and said, we're really excited. And actually I shared that we'd had 2 miscarriages because I felt it was really important that people had the full story. I had never heard of a friend of mine that had had a miscarriage, and it was surprising how much out of the woodwork they came when we talked about it. But my husband and I made a really clear decision that we wanted to talk about it and to provide a space for people to talk about it. So we started up with some friends of ours an initiative at our church, which was called Waiting for Children, which provided a space for people that were on that journey and had basically experienced either pregnancy loss or were struggling with infertility, to wrestle with the bigger questions, what their theology was in the face of really acute suffering and unanswered prayer. And I think that's still ongoing, and I think it's changed me forever.
There is such a lack of research into miscarriage. We're still so unsure of why it happens. This kind of in-between state of a mother who hasn't carried a baby to full term, but still feels changed in some way. When it comes to motherhood and the machine, technology provides incredible gains in saving the lives of premature babies. Even after a baby is born, they're still not out of the woods. We heard from neonatal intensive care doctor and medical ethicist Dominic Wilkinson in episode 2 on the huge potential and limitations of the machine when it comes to saving the lives of premature babies.
The technology that might be used to support a baby can sometimes offer hope.
But sometimes, even their best medical efforts and technology cannot save the baby.
Sometimes what I need to do in talking to parents is to talk about different hopes and to try and understand what hope might look like if we can't actually get baby home. So that might include supporting the family to be able to have some experiences, even if they're brief, of holding their baby, possibly getting out of a neonatal unit, going to a hospice with their baby, or even getting home.
His experience as a practicing doctor in some of the most tragic circumstances has taught him about the many shades of grief and hope.
I think there's an almost universal experience of parenthood, which is that we can have these dreams and ideas about what it's going to be like, but it's always different. Sometimes profoundly and distressingly so. Other times it's just different. And lots of the experience of parents whose child, for example, is diagnosed with serious disabilities, there can be profound grief associated with that, but also there's an important adjustment to a different type of future, a future that might still be valuable and precious and involve lots of love, but a different life and a different future than they had imagined for themselves and for their child. So there is, in the same way, I guess, with some of these technologies, an adjustment for us to have between the dream of motherhood and the reality.
So, Maddy, neither of us have experienced pregnancy loss at any stage or experienced the death of a child, and it's really difficult to talk about.
I thought it was really powerful talking to Dominic Wilkinson about his experience in neonatal care here. It was powerful to me that he spoke, having such a huge experience of being alongside parents in those worst moments, that he spoke about anything approaching hope, and actually that there was grief for even the parents for whom the worst didn't happen, around the sort of changing expectations or things not being quite how they imagined, that there is still a space there for something hopeful. I think I have a little bit of experience of this because my first child was born with talipes, which is better known as clubfoot, and that was diagnosed first at the 20-week scan. And at first we actually couldn't understand what the sonographer was saying. Like, we didn't understand the word. We actually didn't know what we were being told. And my first question was, is this life-threatening? And she was just saying, I'm so sorry. Not helpful. And then we sort of went outside and Googled it, and it was like, oh, okay, right, yes, clubfoot, we can deal with that. And then there was a confirmation scan, and then there was a moment in that scan where one of the sonographers thought that there might be something with the brain, and then had to call a more senior doctor, and the doctor was like, no, it's fine. And it was just these sort of series of thinking you're going to have to face and then not facing what, obviously, again, you said you felt lucky. Like, obviously for lots of parents it goes the other way. And I think for me the whole process, sort of, when you're pregnant, you kind of have this sense that nothing's going to interrupt this perfect life that your child's going to have, and it's all very abstract. And I think very early on we realised there are going to be interruptions in this life and there are going to be things about her life which are difficult, that are not as easy as you want them to be as a parent, but still manageable. And now this also is somewhere that we're really grateful for the machine, because in fact in her generation, which wouldn't even have been the case so much in my generation, it is very correctable. And I was still a big part of our lives. She still has to wear a brace at night and for about 12 to 14 hours a day. So she sort of can't walk in that time. But basically the technology has transformed the life that she is able to have.
Yeah, and part of the pain, I guess, or the texture of being a parent, being a mother, is the grief and the loss and the reality that life isn't perfect. We are not machines. We are not kind of unfeeling, unwavering. And we've talked about in previous episodes about kind of how much being a mother is a very bodily experience. So I think about my children who are still young. My youngest is 2.5. I love cuddles from him, where he kind of just buries himself in me. There are times when it feels like we're still one person. So we're kind of that close. There's like no separation between us.
And early motherhood is just being clambered on all the time, I think, basically.
A lot of limbs, a lot of kind of nuzzling. But I spoke to a friend who's a mother of older children. Her children are kind of in their 20s, I think. And you kind of forget, oh yeah, you're still a mother when you've got old children. But she talked about how part of being a mother of older children is learning to like touch them less, or kind of not have them cuddle you as much, having less control, and the kind of grief of that. And she told me about, there's a section in a book called Little Fires Everywhere by Celeste, and where it's this mother talking about how when her child was young, that they used to kind of very much be kind of very cuddly and together, and there was a loss of kind of caressing. And she writes, parents learn to survive touching their children less and less. And then she describes how her teenager, Pearl, how with Pearl, caresses had become rare. A peck on the cheek, a one-armed, half-hearted hug, and all the more precious because of that. It was the way of things, Mia thought to herself. But how hard it was. The occasional embrace, a head leaned for just a moment on your shoulder, when what you really wanted more than anything was to press them to you and hold them so tight you fused together and could never be taken apart. It was like training yourself to live on the smell of an apple alone, when what you really wanted was to devour it, to sink your teeth into it and consume it, seeds, core, and all.
It's very, it's about, there's always letting go.
Yeah. So we've explored how grief is a universal experience. It's part of the parenting journey in different ways, but for some parents, both mothers and fathers, the worst nightmare becomes a reality. The loss of a child is the very depth of human grief, where hope feels absent. In his short memoir, Lament for a Son, the philosopher Nicholas Walterstoff, whose own son Eric died in a mountaineering accident aged 25, described his grief as a feeling of endless neverness. He also spoke of the impossibility of generalising about grief, writing, "Death is the great leveller. They have always told us. Of course they are right, but they have neglected to mention the uniqueness of each death, and the solitude of suffering which accompanies that uniqueness. We say, I know how you are feeling, but we don't." And perhaps this is why initiatives like the Scottish Memorial Book or baby loss certificates feel so important. Maybe this is why we tend to our deceased with such care, why we mark their graves, remember anniversaries. It is specific people, individual loves that have been lost. Just as our losses mark us as individuals too, Walterstoff goes on to reflect on Jesus telling Thomas, "Put your hand into my wounds and you will know who I am." The wounds of Christ are his identity, which are not erased with his resurrection. Wolterstorff reflects that he too bears the wounds of Eric's death, writing, "If you want to know who I am, put your hand in." And yet we may find comfort sharing in others' grief. Perhaps the most famous example of maternal loss is Mary's grief for her son Jesus at the foot of the cross, a moment depicted in some of the most recognisable artworks of all time. Pieta, meaning pity in Italian, are drawings or sculptures depicting Mary holding the dead body of Christ. There's this beautiful Ukrainian Lenten hymn in which Mary is speaking of her grief at the foot of the cross her child is dying on. It says, "What becomes of me now? A lonely orphan. I'm alone in this world, as a blade of grass I stand." Now, as we've heard, there is no word in the English language to describe a parent who's lost a child. This word, orphan, goes some way towards putting language around it. This series has asked what machines can do for us and where the line between humanity and technology might begin and end. But in the end, the love that we feel for one another, felt so painfully when we lose those we love, cannot be outsourced. It is powerful because it is personal, and what machines cannot do is grieve for us. Nicholas Wolterstorff recalls a friend telling him they had given copies of his Lament for a Son to all his children. When he asked why, his friend told him, "Because it is a love song." Ultimately, grief is a powerful part of love, all kinds of love. C.S. Lewis, reflecting on the loss of his wife, wrote, "The pain I feel now is the happiness I had before. That's the deal." The connection between grief and love echoes throughout the ages, but what's more, it doesn't just go in one direction. For some women, grief became a gateway into radical visions of divine love. We spoke to Dr. Sarah Apatray about the surprising impact of maternal grief on radical writers in the early modern period.
There are various accounts of salvation in Protestant England in this period.
Sarah is senior tutor and fellow in early modern Christian thought and spirituality at Campion Hall at the University of Oxford, and author of The Reformation of the Heart, Gender and Radical Theology in the English Revolution.
There's high Calvinism, which boils down to a narrative in which God elects only a very small portion of humankind for eternal life and predestines the majority to everlasting damnation. Then there's the kind of softer version, whereby in theory Christ dies for everyone, but only a portion accept it.
Her work has uncovered the ways in which maternal love and maternal loss has shaped not just individual writers, but even the course of the history of Christianity, not only in areas we might expect, such as the place and dignity of women, but on things like religious toleration, the nature of God, and the doctrine of salvation.
Very few took a step further to claim that, in fact, Christ really died for everyone, not just in theory, but in practice, and God would restore all at the end of everything.
As it turns out, women were disproportionately represented among those who held to this most radical account, known as universalism.
And the implication of this for their understanding of who God was really profound. God was not a penalising judge, but a loving, merciful mother figure.
They used the language of motherhood to characterise God as unconditionally loving, longing to draw all her children to herself. And there was something else that was striking about these women.
Almost without exception, these were women who had lost children.
For example, one of the most influential universalists was the London prophetess Jane Lead, who lost 2 children as infants.
She became a major influence on German pietist theologians with her really radical vision of the restoration of all things, which goes back to one of the sort of pre-Augustinian early Christian fathers, Origen.
She taught that everything was restored, not just the whole of humanity, but also the devil and his angels.
One of her associates was Anne Bathurst, another prophetess who recorded her really powerful dreams of the restoration of all humanity. And in these dreams, her 2 deceased infants came dancing towards her. I'm just going to quote her, like 2 bright sparks, one after another. And they entered into this great light and became one with it. So very much a mystical vision. It's an account of the union of all things, which is very reminiscent of the medieval writers.
Bathurst herself has some really beautiful breastfeeding imagery, which is related to her own experience of infant loss.
So she talks about Christ as having breasts which are sore with the fullness of milk. They're hot and burning. Where are thy children, good Lord, and what is this for? I am in tears lest the child should want it, whilst I am overfull with it.
It's a poignant account of her breasts full of milk, literally aching for the lost children she is unable to feed.
And that for her is an image of Christ's sort of burning love for humanity.
And then we have Lady Eleanor Davis, the first public advocate of the doctrine of universal salvation,
affirming a very generous account of redemption, very much on account of their deceased infants. And that language is used in their explanation of why they've turned to this very generous account of salvation. It's because of their loss of infants.
For these women, it wasn't just about wishful thinking. Their sense of limitless loss inspired a vision of God's limitless love.
It's not just a kind of move they make to make themselves feel better. I see it very much as part of a broader programme of affirming the generosity of divine love. Divine love has to be broad enough to encompass all souls, including the most helpless.
Strikingly, a sense of the depth of maternal love was not only encapsulated by women who had lost children. Various radical men, including Oliver Cromwell's chaplain, Peter Sterry, drew on maternal imagery in their writing. And we also find a renewed interest among those who had lost their own mothers, as they reflected on the significance of that relationship in their own lives.
The apprehension of God as mother is not exclusive to those who have had a maternal experience of their own. You do also find it in female visionaries of this period who have had a very powerful experience of maternal love in the form of their own mother, and the loss of that figure leads them to reflect on the nature of divine love and to reach for maternal imagery.
Nonetheless, it's true to say that it was the intimacy of that loving relationship, whether experienced as mother or child, that seemed to speak to them in their descriptions of God.
It's not polemic. They're not explicitly arguing against an alternative vision of God. In many cases, when women are talking about a kind of transformation in their understanding of God, they do talk about a shift from this apprehension of God that's something external to themselves, that's a tyrannical figure, an overbearing figure. And what makes all the difference to them is experiencing God as something inward, something intimate to their experience, that's so intimately related to their own heart, their own passions, their own affections, that they can start to think of their own experiences of unconditional love for children, in the case of those who are mothers, as something that is sacred, something that is given something that is an affinity with divine love.
Motherhood, and maternal grief in particular, became the catalyst for the Universalists' radical visions of divine love in the 17th century. But what about now? How do motherhood, loss and change shape our relationship to the world today?
Mothers Rise Up started about 5 years ago now. Some mothers that were at a climate march basically got together, realised a few of them lived quite near each other, but more broadly realised that they all shared like a unifying belief that things could get better.
That's Lorna Powell. We hear increasingly about climate grief in our own time, and I spoke to Lorna Powell and Bongi Kellner from the campaigning group Mothers Rise Up about how their motherhood has impacted their advocacy for climate justice, including, perhaps surprisingly, how it's kept them from despairing about things to come.
And I think actually within the sphere of climate activism, it's very doomy and it's very angry and everything's going to fall apart. And all of those feelings are really valid, but they don't speak to us as a group that much because, yes, we agree with all of that, but what we're going to do now because we've got kids. So I think they kind of united around that. And then they decided to arrange a big march, like a parent march. They had like thousands and thousands of parents that came, and yeah, it just snowballed from there. And then we started doing work in insurance, and it's absolutely crucial to climate change because any fossil fuel project needs multiple insurance policies. So if you can get enough of those insurers to turn around and say, actually, we're not going to do it from our business point of view, it becomes uninsurable. And that's what's happened with coal outside of China. So actually now you can't insure a coal mine because of insurance campaigning. So it's really effective. Our kind of modus operandi is peaceful, positive, family-friendly, inclusive, but not taking any shit. Yes, it might look quite fluffy and it's colourful, but it's got a really serious strategy.
We explored whether it was motherhood itself that had made them more optimistic and action-focused, or whether they had always had that outlook on life.
I would say I was never really doom and gloomy, even before I had my daughter, but I am a lot more positive now because I think personally I wouldn't have had kids if I didn't believe that there was the possibility of a better future.
That's Bongi Kellner. That hopefulness is part of what drew Kellner to Mothers Rise Up.
I think having a child made me hook onto that even more because I obviously want to build a better future for my daughter, but I do actually believe that's possible.
Like the 17th century Universalists, Kellner doesn't see this hope as wishful thinking, but as a call to get involved with that better future.
I do believe that we will see a future in renewables and that our kids will grow up and have an amazing life, but I know that this is the turning point where that has to happen. I think it's just making sure that everything is going towards the right direction, and being a part of that for me is really important because I want her to see what I've done to make that world happen.
This question is politically sensitive. While we were preparing for this episode, the now Vice President of the USA, J.D. Vance, controversially stated that the entire future of his opponents, the Democrats, is controlled by people without children. He focused his criticism on the presidential candidate, Kamala Harris, but more broadly argued that those without children, quote, don't really have a direct stake in the country, in the future. And this is a trope that we've seen in our politics too, with Andrea Leadsom withdrawing from the 2016 Conservative leadership election after criticism she faced for suggesting her opponent, Theresa May, might have less of a stake in the future because she didn't have children. I spoke with Bongi and Lorna about this tension between acknowledging the ways in which having children might have shifted your perspective, while also recognising that all of us have a very real stake in what happens in the future. And of course, at the same time, many mothers also turn inwards towards their children, rather than outwards towards the world. Interestingly, Bongi and Lorna both had quite different perspectives on how motherhood itself had influenced them. Lorna was already deeply involved in the environmental movement.
Before I joined Mothers Rise Up, I'd been very, very mobilised about climate issues, and I'd worked in South America, and it wasn't so much climate change but more like environmental issues affecting kids, but that was before I had children.
Lorna witnessed the terrible effects of pollution, illegal waste dumping in a river and lead poisoning in children near where she worked.
So that made me really angry on their behalf, and obviously like anger's not a very useful emotion unless you do something with it, and so that experience taught me to use that anger and listen to it. And I think when I had kids, I suppose that kind of anger, worry, concern just solidified my desire to do something about it. And it's made me more fiercely optimistic than perhaps I was.
I think it was a bit different for me, actually, because I didn't grow up in the UK. I grew up in lots of different African countries, but I think our relationship with the environment in those countries is a lot different to how it is here. And we're a lot more connected to where we are, our communities, what we engage with or interact with or eat, like where that comes from.
Moving to the UK in that regard was eye-opening.
Like I came to study here, and then suddenly when I became a mother, I was like, okay, I need to make time for this because I need to fight for a better future. So it like ignited something inside me.
There was also a sense in which she had lost a previous version of herself.
Where I was, I guess, naturally like a little bit more free-spirited, and I was like a little bit all over the place. And then I was like, I need more structure, and I need more almost like proof of what I'm doing with my time that I'm here, like on Earth. And that's when I was like, I need to be part of a community that understands this drive that I have. I think becoming a mother forced me to learn more about it and educate myself more about it, because naturally you want to have an idea of the world you would leave behind if you weren't here anymore. What kind of world would your children live in? And you want to obviously leave behind the most positive world you can.
It's interesting that so much of what we hear goes back to that idea of like future generations, and what I have said is it's very future facing to think about Mothers Rise Up, but actually you've unpacked a whole other dimension there around actually often becoming a mother really faces you with your own mortality as well. And like, it's not just a sort of positive must fight for the future, but you're like, I don't know if you felt like this, but it's, oh, I've joined the middle generation now.
Yeah, totally.
I'm no longer the young generation. Yeah. And so that you mentioned several times about the time I've got left, or what I've done with my time, or the world I leave behind, that actually I don't think we necessarily hear that dimension so much.
I think it sort of has opened my eyes to, whoa. I've started reading a new book, and like the first few lines in it was talking about how there's like very few moments in your life where the world opens up like down into like reality and like the bigger picture basically. And this author was saying it's birth and death. And so everything stops. You know, there's very few moments in our life, apart from if someone's been born or died, that everything stops and shifts and changes. And so I guess we're all running along in this very distracted kind of survival way, which is normal. And that's like how the human brain works. And then when there's these big life moments, that's when you really get, whoa, this is what it's all about, actually. Like, you don't really have that very often. And I'm sure other people would get a similar reaction to other big life events.
It's the same as like if you get really sick and it's a matter of life and death, you suddenly have a different perspective and you're like, okay, what actually matters? And I think the worse the situation is, or the more extreme it is, the less things actually matter. For me, definitely that extreme thing for me was giving birth or having a baby. I now value fewer things, but I value them a lot more. And I think that really helped me live a more fulfilling life, weirdly, because I realized I was like spreading my energy really thin when I just needed it to be concentrated in very few things.
It's not just that you can only care about the future if you're a parent, but that actually you just become very aware of your time. Has just moved a bit further forward.
Hey everyone, Chine here. Well, one Sunday evening while we were in the final stages of this podcast, I got this from Maddy.
Hello, I'm just going to send you a voice note because I'm in a very undramatic situation, in fact.
As you'll know, Maddy's pregnant with her second child. and she wasn't due for another few weeks, but had been having contractions.
Where to start? Basically, they're not sure whether it's progressing so quickly that this is going to be it, or whether they can try and stave off labour for a bit longer. Probably not going to be in the office this week. But I mean, I might have a baby by the morning, but I might also not. Yes, it's very bad timing for the podcast. I'm sorry, but I can get loads of field work done.
Well, this is the reality of motherhood. It's messy and it's unpredictable and not necessarily what we'd expected or planned. But never fear, I'm delighted that our executive producer, Stephanie, is going to join me to wrap up the podcast. Welcome, Stephanie.
Hey, Ginny. Happy to hop in.
Thank you very much.
So in that very curious way in which art mirrors life and life mirrors art, our podcast about wrestling with motherhood and its messiness and unexpected interruptions has had its own unexpected interruption.
Yeah, it's kind of poetic. I kind of like it.
Yes, it's definitely very meta.
Yeah, and it's about to get a bit more meta, isn't it? So the vulnerability that we've been looking at and exploring in all of the episodes of this podcast, which we've said is very tied up with love, it's kind of nowhere felt more deeply and painfully than in loss. It's bodily limitation, it's loss of relationship, it's the most tragic reality of human limits. And this is a pain that comes out of all of what it is to be a mother or a parent, and it can't be mechanized. And I wondered if you would share, Stephanie, about your personal story of being involved in this podcast.
Yeah. In many ways, very, very meta. So when you had first reached out to ask if I could help create this podcast, I had actually been asking a lot of these questions about motherhood myself, because I was actually expecting to be a mother. I think it was actually just a week before I had learned that I was pregnant. But by the time that we actually began production, things had changed. I'd had some minor bleeding. We went into the hospital to get an ultrasound, and there on the screen was what looked like this tiny, beautiful blueberry. And it was beating like a heart. And that was our child. And the midwife said, "Congratulations, everything looks completely fine." And yeah, it's hard to, I mean, I guess you probably know what that first sight is like. And we'd even had a meeting after that, the first meeting with the midwife, planning some of that pregnancy. But just a couple days afterwards, the bleeding got worse. And within a few more days, everything was gone. So it just felt like this kind of tiny blip in our lives. And honestly, I think I'm still trying to find the language to process what happened. I think it was particularly unexpected and hard because we had just seen it. But one of the things I appreciated about your observation at the start of this episode was that we don't really have words in the English language to describe what that kind of loss is like. And I think certainly for me, in more ways than one, it felt like you're grieving something that doesn't have a name. Certainly, there's the child that you never got to know, the future that you only really imagined. And I think all of that makes the grief a little more difficult to articulate. And I think it's also strange because, that was, for us, it was around the 2-month mark. And at that point, most of the people in our lives didn't even know that I'd been pregnant, which made it even stranger to have this huge thing happening behind the scenes and to be going to work and not have any of that, on the surface. I think it's hard and sad and messy, and still don't really know what to say about it in some ways. But it's been certainly helpful to hear a lot of other people discussing their processes.
I do wonder whether it's given you, well, it has given you a different perspective than you would have had on working on this project.
Yeah, there was a lot that I resonated with in terms of Karen's conversation at the start of the episode. It can open up a hole in your life, but in some ways that hole also opens up a space for intimacy in unexpected ways. I think there is a way in which loss can also, like love, I guess they go hand in hand, create these kind of expansive worlds of intimacy and vulnerability. And I do think that all of that meant that when we actually started production in September, I was definitely still asking those questions, but perhaps from a very different relational standpoint. Admittedly, I am kind of wary of romanticizing this domain that our society and perhaps especially the church does tend to romanticize, because so much of our relationships to motherhood with our own mothers can be, frankly, quite messy. And so I think, with the Mothers Rise Up, there was a moment that I felt a little skeptical with the suggestion that motherhood activates this thirst for justice. And, in fact, there's actually this whole history of critiquing activists and activist feminists in particular as neglecting their maternal responsibilities, being unmotherlike. And that was part of the propaganda that was used against suffragettes and the quote-unquote bra-burning feminists of the 1960s.
Well, yeah, and this is the thing that I feel very self-conscious in talking about and writing about, this kind of idea of motherhood awakening us to injustice. But I think the way that I've come to be able to talk about it is that I think there are lots of ways that people can be turned outwards. And for me, it was becoming a mother that was my most profound altering. For others, it might be other things. But I love how Toni Morrison, in a speech in 2000, talked about how actually, in order to create a fairer, more just world, we all need to be able to think beyond my children or even my grandchildren, but think about all of our children and what that means for those of us who have biological children or who have children, but also those who don't. Like, how can we collectively think about the future and think about all of our children? And also Hannah Arendt, the philosopher who was writing in a post-Second World War, she didn't have children, but she talked about natality, kind of the idea of creation, birth, bringing things into life, including being a parent, was a kind of beautiful way to combat the brutality of what the world had seen. So she talks about natality being the miracle that saves the world. And she's someone who wasn't a mother herself.
Yeah, in some ways, I think that it is a false binary, motherhood and activism. And I love that idea of mother as a verb, as opposed to simply an identity. I do think that there is something about motherhood and change and grief itself that has the potential to open us up to these new ways of seeing and relating to ourselves and to others and the world we live in. What I appreciated most about that opening story about Karen's infertility was how it actually expanded her circle of mothering beyond blood and biology. And, we talked about how the 17th century Universalists and their grief over their lost children inspired these expansive visions of God's radical and limitless love, merging both the personal and the political. And for perhaps that most famous mother of all, Mary, the discovery that she would mother Jesus inspired her song, which is still sung by many Christians throughout the world today, the Magnificat. And I think there's actually a way in which the Magnificat brings together these tensions between Karen's story and Mothers Rise Up to draw out those divinely inclusive and expansive possibilities of what mothering can mean. It literally encourages Mary to burst into song. Would you share her song, the Magnificat, with us?
Yeah, I won't burst into song, but I will read it. From Luke. My soul magnifies the Lord, and my spirit rejoices in God my Saviour. For he has looked on the humble estate of his servant. For behold, from now on all generations will call me blessed. For he who is mighty has done great things for me, and holy is his name. And his mercy is for those who fear him from generation to generation. He has shown strength with his arm. He has scattered the proud in the thoughts of their hearts. He has brought down the mighty from their thrones and exalted those of humble estate. He has filled the hungry with good things, and the rich he has sent away empty. The machine can help avert some of the human tragedies which we've considered in this episode, and in fact through all of the series. But at the same time, for very little of any of this does it make sense to ask, what could be outsourced? This, in the end, is what it is to be human, mourning our losses, thirsting for justice, and thankful where there is new life. You've been listening to Motherhood versus the Machine from the think tank Theos. Hosted by Dr. Madeleine Pennington and me, Chine MacDonald. Stephanie Tam is our executive producer, David Benjamin Blower is our audio editor and sound designer, and Daniel Turner is our recording engineer and assistant producer. Our thanks to the Fetzer Institute for generously funding this project.